I recently talked about the Takuba. This is the sword of the Sahara, or a large part of the Sahara, and beyond actually. And it's a really interesting and beautiful kind of African sword. A very characteristic one together with the Nimcha and perhaps the Cascada. Well, there are many more, of course, but among the most known or recognizable ones, I would say. And actually, the Takuba I talked about is hanging right there on the wall behind me. But today we have another Takuba because, well, one, I can't help myself. And two, I thought I'd film a video showing off this one as well because I assume as a sword collector that any other person who's really into swords isn't happy with just seeing one, but whenever you can see more or some differences, it'll be a good video. So I hope you have the same mindset, and with that in mind, I think we can dive right into the close-ups of this one. And here we have our Takuba close-up. We'll start, of course, by looking at the whole assembly, including the scabbard, because Takuba scabbards are actually really lovely. And this one, I think in particular, well, no, I don't know if in particular, the other one we saw in the previous video was also really nice, but this one is different, but equally nice, at least equally as nice. So the first thing we see are these two leather straps that hold up the sword, so it would be hanging on these loops here. In this case, there's even a bit of fabric here. I think this was, this fabric loop was mostly, I assume, to hang it on a wall or something, but it's possible that this was part of the original assembly. These, if you remember, the previous Takuba we saw are actually way wider and more elaborate. So you see some decoration has been like embossed onto the leather here. And whereas the other Takuba had basically just two loops of leather, here we have two leather, well, these are also loops, I suppose, because they're open here. But then the actual fastening rings here, or the way the sword would have been hung, is through these smaller loops that are basically bolted onto this first section of leather here. So if we look at the back, they're actually not even bolts, they're more like staples. Let me get close up here. So you can see they're not riveted in place, but these bolts actually have the two arms like a staple and close in place. This is, I suppose, stapled, but then we also have stitching to hold everything in place too. This is also not the strongest leather, I would say, but definitely it's more resistant. It feels thicker and more solid than what we saw in the previous Takuba, which was a very, very delicate kind of leather. Moving on to the scabbard proper. So at the throat here we have a section of leather, and then it's wrapped here with a brass ring that is fixed here in place. So it's a sheet of brass that then is kind of fixed here at the back. What you'll see here is that there's some open work in the brass, and under here you see some red fabric poking through. So that's a nice element of decoration, I think. Of course, the brass has some decorative engravings all around it here with kind of geometric designs. As for the scabbard, it's completely made of leather. So the other one, if you remember, had almost like a sections. It was very protruding here on the edges, and then this intersection was very depressed compared to the outside. Here we have a more standard scabbard, I would say. It's a leather, I assume there's wood inside because it's fairly solid, and then it's covered in leather. You see, unfortunately, it is starting to degrade on some spots. But apart from that, we have some nice decoration here too. We see some little brass dots here, rivets popping out. I wonder if these held something, if these were the base for some decoration, or if this was the actual, what was meant as the final decoration here. We have some more embossed circles and other decorations here. And then we have the chape, which is really interesting because it goes back to that initial decoration we saw on the throat. So we have this open brasswork with a red fabric underneath it to kind of give a little bit of pop in terms of decoration. We have that at the back too. We can see how this section of the chape is closed in place. So again, it's sheet that is basically overlaps here and then is pressed together. Interestingly enough, the scabbard itself does not have any stitches. So I think it's fixed in place by simply gluing the, you see the edge here of the leather, which I don't know what leather it could be, but maybe someone else will be able to answer that. But you see it's glued in place here. There's no stitching or anything. So overall, a very lovely scabbard. I don't know if it's more decorated than the one we saw. Well, we'll compare them too. Coming to the sword, we can actually unsheath it. Unfortunately, as you can see, the sword does not completely fit into the scabbard. So I wonder, I'm questioning if this is its original scabbard. You can see that the leather on the hilt here is actually a different color than what you see on the rest of the scabbard. So this is more black. This is a dark brown. So it could be that it's not its exact fit, but it could also be that there's some kind of debris in the bottom of the scabbard, or for some other reason it doesn't completely fit. So I don't know. But I'll unsheath it so we can actually see the blade in all of its glory. So we'll start with the hilt. The hilt has, of course, the typical crossguard. In this case, it's actually rather thick. It's wrapped in leather as well. And then there's this green tab that's glued on. I don't know if it's to hold things in place, if it was its original purpose was to be there, what it is. It's definitely a part of the sword, though. This isn't like a piece of paper, I feel. So I don't know what this is, but we have it, so I'm talking about it. The cylindrical grip is the typical one you would expect here. Thicker, I think, than the other one I have, so that's also something to note. And the pommel here, if you remember, the other cascara had more of a like a nut-shaped pommel in a sense. This one has, you'll see a lot of these on cascaras. Very often it's a, I don't really know how to describe it. It's a disc pommel, but then has a whole bunch of layers on the disc itself. It has these two balls here that are riveted in place, and then it kind of comes down in a pyramid shape, and it's peened. So here you actually see the peen. Moving on to the blade, I'll give a quick overview here. So it has the typical very broad forte, and then as you move up, it kind of tapers down symmetrically and then reaches a rounded tip. We also have the three fullers that are fairly common on many cascara variants. Although this one you'll see is in a sense more elaborate, but in another sense less. More elaborate because instead of being a one gouge into the steel, we have this kind of dot work. So this seems like it was done by puncturing a whole bunch of little dots in a line. Less fancy because, as you can see, there were some mistakes made at some point. So you see here the kind of dot kind of goes off its line and then gets picked up again, and then the line kind of is a bit crooked. Same thing happens here. You see there's something happened at this point in the decoration and they had to kind of fix it to continue. But blade is slightly dirty, I have to say. And then we have two half moon decorations. These are very typical on Takuba blades. And by the way, I think I may have said cascara a few times in this video now that I think about it. So disregard that. It's a Takuba, of course. And these, we see a lot of these. These are probably inspired by the half moon shape you would see on many European swords, and then were re-elaborated or reimagined by local smiths. This, by the way, is the least European looking version of these that I've seen. Normally they kind of have a little face. This one instead is more of a half moon with a line cutting through it. We see this on both sides. So this is an interesting little bit of information, I think. The blade is fairly stiff, I would say, more than fairly stiff. This is a stiff slab of steel, and it is so more or less along the whole length. So if I hold it here, you'll see that I'm running up to, let's say, the last third here. And if I try bending here, this is kind of the maximum flex that you can comfortably get out of it. And if I go to the tip here, it doesn't really flex much more. So it's and you can feel that because you'll see here how thick the center of the blade is. even when I hold it really close to the tip. So it does have distal taper. It is an actual blade, but this distal taper is not as dramatic as it could be. And this blade maintains a lot of weight to it. It is sharp on both sides. We see diagonal file marks here and also here, which is interesting because the file follows the same direction regardless of the edge it's filing. So on this one, it's kind of filing towards the tip, and this way it's filing away from the tip. We also have some horizontal grind marks, which we saw also on the previous cascade as well. So that's interesting, but they're not here close to the edge. It's more like the whole blade has these grind marks. And I do feel some inconsistencies just by kind of running my hand on the blade here. It's not like a flat, perfectly flat slab that was then formed into a blade. You do feel some bumps, like some ridges and dips, which is interesting. It has the typical rounded tip, I think I already mentioned. But this one is quite... You'll see it's thinner than the tip of my finger, so it's not one of the most egregious rounded tips I've seen. Overall, a very lovely blade, which we will now, I think, take advantage of cleaning because I have a sponge at hand. And some autosol as well. So we will give it a quick wipe just because... Well, you should always clean your swords as soon as you receive them. There's no reason not to do that. So here we go. This should be fairly quick though, because the blade is not in bad shape by any stretch of the imagination. But I think you will have noticed this little bit of rust here, so it's good to address that as quickly as possible. The blade is really springy too, so it doesn't flex a lot, but it's very lively as a blade. A little bit of cleaning here as well. Just kind of get the grime off at least, and give it a little bit of... I have to be a little careful with this one because it's actually quite sharp. So this is the kind of cleaning job that could easily end up with a trip to the hospital. Okay, I think this will be probably enough if we're limiting ourselves to autosol for this cleanup, which I think we will. So I have my trusty rag here to clean it up, and I think the results speak for themselves. This was old dirt, so it was already here, but this gray dirt you see is from the Takuba here. So clean it up, and we'll see if it tells us anything further, if there's anything else we can kind of spot on it. So, rust is gone. That's the good news. What we can see, I think, is the edge of sharpening. So it was sharpened, you can see pretty clearly actually, up to here, which is about 40% of the length. So it seems like the proper cutting edge, maybe even almost halfway, to be honest. It's about here, so 40 to 50% of the blade. This part is heavily sharpened. This part is not at all, not even close. So you'll see it has about 1 millimeter thickness, if not even a little bit more, perhaps. This obviously would make this an ideal paring kind of section of the blade. It's really thick on both sides, so it's wide and thick. And this section would be an ideal cutting edge. If we look at the balancing, point of balance here, we have it, well, it's about here, so just slightly above over the markings here. This is all very homebrew measurement, of course, but point of balance is here, so relatively far up. It's a pretty heavy blade, so this falling onto your head or onto your shoulder would definitely do a lot of damage, and if then there's some pull action, this would be cutting off limbs, I think, fairly easily. So here you have it, my second Takuba, and one I hope you enjoyed seeing, and also one that if you have any insights on, I hope you will share them in the comments. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon in another sword video. Bye!